Hello and welcome to our Saturday Live. Thank you for joining us for the session today. And of course, thank you to AdGully for partnering with us for this session. Today, we discuss healthcare PR. This vertical was a niche until about earlier this year. Not anymore. Every vertical in PR is being asked to double up or get experienced consultants or add this expertise this year. So, what is unique about this vertical of PR? Why is it essential for someone in, let's say, lifestyle or technology to add this expertise to their offerings today? How does it work? What are the local, national, and global repercussions if you miss this boat? To answer this and more, we have with us today Rimmi Harindran, the Regional Head of Communications APAC, Global Head of Communications General Medicine and Endocrinology, Merck Healthcare. A little bit about Rimmi before we add her on. Rimmi is a passionate communicator with diversified international experience across corporate reputation management, brand communications, crisis management, corporate social responsibility, and public relations. In her current role at Merck Healthcare, she manages the overall communications mandate spanning 12 countries in the region. She is a critical member of the regional leadership and is also the co founder and lead of Women in Leadership Asia Council for Merck. In June 2020, she took on an additional assignment as the head of communications for the General Medicine and Endocrinology, leading communications for the global franchise. Prior to Merck, she has served in leadership comms roles in Monsanto, the Heroes Project, and done stints with PR agencies as well. She has also served as a jury member on several panels, including the Global Awards, United Way's CSR Awards, and the Asia Pacific Sabre Awards. So, without much ado, let's add Rimmi to our conversation. Hi, Rimmi.
Hi, Tarun. Thank you
How
for
are
having me.
you? Most welcome. I mean, how are you doing?
Good. It's a great time to be in communications, to be alive, and most importantly, it's the weekend, so I'm very happy.
I do hope it'll be a fabulous weekend for you. But before we dive into healthcare PR, tell us a little bit more about your personal journey into the PR space.
So it's a story that maybe helps me believe in destiny. Because if you asked me when I started off, about what 18 years ago, I wouldn't have thought of this for myself. My formal education is in commerce. I did financial accounting, and it was just a decision at that time. One of those young and innocent decisions you make when you're ambitious and you think that you choosing that stream of work, allows you many more opportunities.
Right.
And then I was fairly a good student, so I did well at what I was doing. And then when I graduated one day, I was like, okay, is this really what I want to do? Is this really what I want? How I want to live my life? And then I said, okay, let's take the opportunity to study some more. Went on to mass communications, picked something which was a course that allowed you a broad range of subjects, right from journalism to PR and production, everything in between. It really opened up. I think there's something that you believe that's inherent in you, and you don't always capitalize on. And I think that opportunity, that course opened up avenues for me. I was very clear that this is what I wanted to do. And then PR happened purely by accident because I was in a big hurry to start off working, make my own money, make my own mark, and all of that. And though my internships were in production,
Right.
I applied across all verticals, and PR responded before anything else. Okay, fine. It was a job at hand. I was a PR job, so I said, okay, I'm ready for whatever. And I think that the recruiters probably were just happy to hear ready for whatever, and they chose healthcare PR for me. I wasn't sure. Like I said, I was a commerce student. I had no background in the sciences. And I think they just were happy to have someone who was open to do things. I didn't know what I was getting into because the first day I went in, I realized that I had Apollo hospitals and Bosch and Lomb as my clients. And I was like, okay, I don't know how this works. What does eye health mean? And what is this whole hospital industry? But I think I was in it. It started off, and working in that area and led to more opportunities in that area, and I think that that's just how it happened. And in a career which is solely around healthcare, biotech, communications, with some stints in the other streams, it's been quite exciting. And now I know that probably the decision then was that I'm good with numbers, but I'm better with my words. So PR happened, and healthcare PR happened purely by accident. And if you ask me, like I said 18 years ago, if this is how I would see my life pan out, not at all.
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned this, when you were talking about, uh, your recruiters hearing that you were up for anything, you were game for anything. I think that pretty much stands even today, even now when recruiters look at hiring freshers. That is the attitude that appeals to most of them, right? Because you never know, where life will take you.
Yeah, I mean, if at that time I would have said, "Are you crazy? This is boring, and this is not something I understand and can do," my life would have been very different right now.
Correct. I completely understand. And I think some of the most interesting people that I've met in PR have never really thought about being in PR. It's just that life somehow, has made sure that they land up there.
I think times were also slightly different. I think now you can make an informed decision. There are more examples of what PR can do as well. And I think when you and I started off, Tarun, that was very hazy, right? I mean, PR was like the stepbrother, stepsister, distant cousin of advertising. It was just one small unit which sat within the larger organizations. People didn't know what it meant. People didn't
Right.
know, what this job does. And I remember having conversations even amongst us that what do we tell our parents? I mean, what do we do every day, right? Do we read newspapers? Do we, but the journalists write the articles. It's not us. So I mean that there was so much ambiguity, and it was not as clear. It was not clearly articulated. Things have
Right.
changed now. The avenues are open. There's much more formal education around it, so you can make a much more informed decision now. I think we were blessed to be just kind of like paved into the industry at that point in time.
True. You think the situation has changed now? Do you think people, if somebody were to join PR today, would they be able to explain to the parents what they do?
Better so, better so. I would say, because um, you think about it, 20 years ago, what kind of communication institutes existed? What kind of formal education, existed? There are several courses now in India which allow you to do a bachelor's degree, a master's course, which is accredited. It doesn't look like it's just another course that is being done. So you are going into it with your eyes open. Whether you like it or not, whether you choose it for your future or not, is another thing. But if you think you have the aptitude, you have the inclination, your parents are willing to also fund you to do those, to pursue that education, of course, I think it's much more easier now than it was, I think, 20 years ago.
Brilliant. I'm sure, it's going to be, like you say, it's going to be much easier for the students coming into the profession now to be able to figure out how to map their career out into PR. So, on that note, let's delve in a little bit more into healthcare PR. So, for the benefit of our viewers, before we start, can you help us define healthcare PR?
It's a
And
tricky one.
about this vertical.
Yeah, it's if you think of it purely from a PR person's point of view,
Right.
in principle, the fundamentals of PR exist, right? What you do on a daily basis, how you see this job pan out, those fundamental principles work. It's about content. It's about, those media relations. It's about advocacy. It's about all of those things put together. But I think a lot of the work that we do, a lot of the industries that we choose, have a
Right.
certain personality, and then therefore by default, then the PR aspect of it, the industry lends its personality to us, right? um Work streams like us, like PR, HR, finance, we I think the beauty of it is that we are standalone and strong, right? It's about how we adapt ourselves to the industry. So, from a healthcare PR perspective, the healthcare industry is diverse. You have pharma on one hand, you have the tertiary sector on the other hand, you have the hospital sector, on the third hand, which is really the front end of it, right? So it's a vast, it's really a vast gamut of principles in that sense, and you that personality gets lent to what you're doing. So it is highly regulated. So therefore, the kind of work you do in PR is much more regulated. You have to be you have to make sure that there are several approvals in place, as opposed to something else, some other industry where it's not as important. So you have it's a highly regulated, it's serious business. It really has a power to impact people's lives. It makes a big difference of what you do on a day-to-day basis. So I think that's the real differentiator, in terms of kind of work that you do, because you cannot, I think of it in a frivolous way. That's that I think, to me, that's the fundamental difference. I'm not saying that any other industry you think of it in a frivolous way, but
Hmm.
the weight of this, it's backed by data, it's backed by research. And what you do has the power to influence, impact a person's life at the end of the day. At the end of the day, the value chain ends with a person's life, whether it means like death related situations like debilitating diseases, or it means just general well-being. But the value chain ends at a person's well-being. So therefore, the healthcare PR aspect of it becomes even more serious in that sense. And I know that when I was like in initial years of my career as well, I would always have people on the team who felt this was very exciting and had the impact, had like tremendous impact. But 3 months down the line, say this is just serious work, and this is really requires heart and effort to do. And a lot of people would choose not to do this. And in today's time as well, I mean, we know that the doctor's profession is one which is more serious. But think about how today it's become, the kind of intensity of it, right, has changed. And therefore, you can link it back to healthcare, you can link it to healthcare PR. So
Right.
what we are facing today, I mean, is a great example of how healthcare PR is shaped and can, has the power to influence.
Completely. The last 2 quarters have pretty much flipped the entire PR industry on its head. And one of the verticals that has gained a lot of prominence is healthcare PR. I think now more than ever, people understand that this is one of the key essentials that they need to, kind of add to their expertise. So, your views on the so-called coming of age of this vertical? I know it was always important because end of the day, it ended in, let's say, an individual like you and me, my
Yeah,
well-being, right?
yeah.
It seems to have gained a lot of prominence in the last 2 quarters. Your views on that?
Absolutely. I mean, pharma as an industry, for example, is always highly criticized, right? It's like, why is pharma so expensive? And for me, like, who's working in a pharma company, we are always the big bad pharma. No matter what kind of initiatives you do, no matter how you look at formulating your policies, you're always looked at as the big bad pharma. From a
Right.
government standpoint, this is your poster boy to bash, right? This is how things are, because people, I think, don't tend to understand what goes in behind one single drug, right? Nothing is just like, it's not a kitchen formula, right? It takes about 10 to 15 years of research to really develop its serious commitment from an organization's point of view. um, you know this, I think, has come of age and hit home now, because even if you think of COVID, for example, and even if you think of how it's being perceived, we don't have a drug. And if serious pharma, serious researchers don't kind of work in this area, we really
Right.
have no hope, right? And also, you think about a vaccine, for example. Everybody's waiting for a vaccine. But
Yeah.
would you really inject something into your body? Forget your own body. Would you inject something into your child's body? which is not tried and tested, which is not regulated, which does not have a proof of success. So
Right.
obviously this becomes like paramount in terms of understanding the importance of it. So pharma healthcare has become, I think, has suddenly gained its time and space, unfortunately, during this time. And therefore, even within communications, I think that the importance of knowing what communications can do has become. So the industry overall has gained prominence, and within the industry, I think there are certain functions which have really got their time on stage now. Like you talk about supply chain, you talk about
Right.
research, you talk about communications. I mean, suddenly everybody has understood the value of these functions now.
True. And in fact, a lot of people across the value chain have now started looking at PR specifically and seriously and trying to create, awareness about what they do. Because each one of them now understands, I think, the basic need of making sure that the consumers understand what they are looking at doing. I think earlier it was fine when farmers used to get bashed, you hardly would see any communication from their end. But now even they have become very proactive about talking and defending themselves. Yeah. So, you've been in a PR agency as well as now you are looking at it from the corporate side as well. You're in a unique position to tell us how this role differs in a healthcare company, a corporate role in a healthcare company versus a role in an agency servicing a healthcare company. How do their roles differ?
I think they're quite interlinked, and I think the power will come if we are able to work together, obviously. So that's like a foundational statement there.
Right.
From when you're working at a PR agency, your strength will come from understanding of the business, because at the
Mm.
end of the day, you're still a third party, right? So you have
Right.
to make, I think, extra efforts to understand the business. At the same time, you carry a very unique view because you have the outside in perspective, and often in
Right.
a corporate communications role, you have the inside out perspective, right? So this makes a big difference, because you sometimes are like a frog in the well, because corporations are so big, there are tons of people working. It's very easy to get caught up in your own organizational web. But having a partner who's on the outside, who brings in the outside in view, makes a big difference. So I think
Right.
that's the biggest strength from an agency point of view. When you're inside, when you're in the company, I think that you really have the inner view. You have access to information, you have a better understanding of how this whole thing functions. You have access to people who help you understand so much better. But at the same time, I've often felt like I play the role of the agency in the company, right? I'm the one who's trying to understand the need. I'm trying to understand what are the kind of solutions I can offer. So for me, I feel like I've never let go of that agency hat. I feel like I'm like an in-house agency within the company, and I feel that most corporate communications people, I think, may feel this way, because we are like the go-to people for solutions, or proactively looking at what are the trends. So if there's a crisis on a particular product in a different market, um,
Right.
you understand, you're able to map the trend to say, this is going to hit us in 2 months, what do we do now, right? So
Yeah.
you're the one who's preempting situations and all of that. So like I said, very often, very very often, I feel like I'm the agency person sitting in the corporate side.
So, which role do you enjoy? Do you really enjoy from the
What do
agency
you mean?
perspective, corporate communication perspective? You mentioned very interestingly the inside out and the outside in view, right? We're going to quote you on that. Um, it's a very interesting way of putting it out there. But when you moved into a corporate communication role, right? What was the biggest surprise that was waiting for you?
Okay, I'm going to be a bit cheeky here. um,
By
from
all
an
means.
agency, from an agency perspective, and if you're when your interfaces with the copcom person, right?
Hmm.
Um, it's a very different view. You think that this person, has you to work on things, and this person can rest easy, right? You feel like that you're the extension of the corporate communications person, and so you're the one who's doing the legwork, and you're the one developing the strategy and the tactics, and this person is the one who's kind of facilitating it within the company. And you feel, and then most often, I remember this, and I'm not ashamed to say this, but I've often felt that like the Copcom person goes home at 5 when I'm working till 10, right? Like, what's happening here? When you go into the corporate, like when I came into the corporate side, I realized that you're bloody doing both. You're doing the job of the agency and you're doing the job of your Copcom person, because the matrix in an organization is complex,
Right.
which I think from an agency side, some definitely, depending on their relationships, have an inside view too. But most often, because you don't have that access, and because you're not pulled into that web of that matrix, you don't realize it. But navigating the internal, functions, internal
Right.
approval, that's a whole new ballgame. And at the end
Right.
of the day, the buck stops with you, right? When you're at an agency, of course you are accountable, but I think that kind of the weight on you when you're on the corporate side is much higher, because at the end of the day, the buck stops with you from an agency point of view, also from an organizational point of view. So my view, I think this is I think very, very interesting. And if the job is what you make of it. Like, if you feel that you want to delve deeper, you really want the organizational success, and you want to be able to contribute to that success, you really have the power to really expand your job as much as possible. There was a time where communication was like one of those functions that was informed later,
Right.
informed later, or informed last minute for you to then firefight and all of that. Things are
Hmm.
changing, and I think that if you if you have been able to prove with your own work ethic and with your commitment that you're able to really contribute, and people start seeing that, you earn your seat at the table. You're
Right.
sitting in all those discussions. So you're not looked at as a communications person, but you're sitting on the business discussions, because they see that there is value in involving you early on, and you can then look at how you build that into communications. So
Right.
again, to also maybe a little bit answer your earlier question on which job I enjoy more, I think the foundation I had, from an agency standpoint, I think still holds true. I'm still responsive to everything that I read, waking up in the morning and checking if there's anything, that is of value. Really being able to be that extended arm to be able to counsel in communications. I think the agency training is really important, and it's amazing, and I feel that it has really lent a lot to my career. But at the same time, I think as experience adds on, to be able to also look at it from a full organizational point of view, um, to understand each function and its contribution, and how you can then bring in your comms expertise into it. This right now, I think, is a great time for me to be able to blend in.
And in fact, you have worn multiple hats and been in multiple countries, handling PR for different organizations. Tell us a little bit about your global journey.
I think I'm was very fortunate, to start with. That it's not often easy that doing what you do, you have the opportunity to, like, take that big leap, go from a country to a global role. It's a world of a difference, because I think headquarter roles are completely different from how you imagine them to be. In a country, you are responsible for driving the tactics based on the strategy that the country has, right? So you're really looking at driving, your overall, like you have a very I think it's a strategic plan, but at the end of the day it boils down to tactics, and you're driving the tactics. And also the return on investment is much easier. So for example, you deliver a campaign, you conceptualize, you build it, you execute it, you see the results for yourself. Okay, if you bomb, you also see the disaster for yourself. But at the same time, there is this gratification in the process, that this is something you built, this is what you did, and you did this. When you move
Right.
to the global role, and especially headquarter roles, not other markets, it's that skew completely changes. It's highly strategic, and the tactics become like that 80-20 gets inverted. Let me say it this way: in a country role, your 80% is tactics, your 20% is strategy. But in
Right.
global roles, what tends to happen often is that you have a worldview, and you're really looking at what is going to be important from your brand perspective, or your disease area or therapy perspective. And you are like, you're wearing the strategy hat more than you're wearing the tactical hat, because you have the countries to drive the tactics that are important from a country perspective. And nobody wants to dictate that in a particular country, because every country behaves differently, the stakeholders are different, the business needs are different. So you wear the strategy hat. Um, and I think what was also very, it took me a long time to digest, was that you also always don't get the credit for it, or you don't see the results, because you're the one who's developing the big picture. You're
Right.
responsible for that big picture, which then gives people the confidence to build on. And then once they build on that, then it's their own. It's their own. And then the results are in the countries or in the regions, and it doesn't very often doesn't come back to you. So for you to be able to shift that mindset to say that I'm not going to be able to see the fruits of my labor in tangible form. I think that
Hmm.
is one of those things that took me a couple of months to realize, because I was feeling very empty at one point in time, saying, okay, what am I really doing, right? But this is the job, and this is how when. And I think this also speaks to when you get senior in your career, you don't always get to see that instant gratification, or there is definitely more people who contributed, like hands and legs to it, and it's not yours own to claim, right? So the big picture, the strategy, the ability to think diverse, because you have from a global perspective, you have the developing countries, you have the developed nations, you have the very mature markets, you have
Yeah.
reimbursed formats, you have self-pay markets. To be able to really understand that whole diversity adds a lot to the way you think you can also develop your communications around it. So that's, I think,
Interesting.
one of the two, three big differences.
Yeah. And what I got from it also was learning how to let go as you move up in your career has been, I'm sure that must have been a huge, learning as such, right?
Yeah, I think letting go has it's a slightly different interpretation here, because as you grow senior into your career and you work with larger teams, you in any case learn to do that, right? You
Mm.
believe in doing that, and that's what builds a good team. But
Correct.
you hold something to yourself, because you know that this is the fruit of my labor, this is what I built, you know but to be able to do something and give it away,
Right.
that's the difference, because you're giving it away. It's like I don't know, it's like giving birth, right? You this is a part of you who then grows on to become their own person. And then can you really stake claim on that? Yes and no, right? I mean, it's one of those things.
Completely understand. So, let's go a little bit deeper into PR as such. How different is PR in this sector in India as compared to other countries? Since you've been with other nations as well, I'm sure you would have seen a marked difference in the way healthcare PR is approached in all these countries. Give us an insight into how do you see, what is the basic difference that you see within this?
I think there are similarities and some differences, right? From a perspective of the fact that healthcare PR or pharma PR per se, it's highly regulated. So you don't really, you're restricted in the way you communicate. You're restricted in the way that you can use brand names or
Hmm.
products. Everything
Right.
goes through like a dozen approvals internally. You would see, and this is something we try to always find creative ways to do. For example, on social media, for example, you will see the most boring accounts, which are from pharma companies, except if you have a very dynamic a spokesperson who keeps building the content. But if you think of it from a business point of view, our social media accounts are boring. It's not because we want to be boring, but because everything that we need to put out there needs to go through approvals. So
Correct.
and if it's a patient query, even if I know what it means, I cannot simply respond to that. It still needs to go through that approval chain, because we are held responsible by authorities, by regulatory authorities, by health authorities. And what you say, even if it's like like one dose versus 1.5 makes a big difference, right?
It
So
does. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so therefore, I think this level of complexity builds into that, right? um, and therefore you look at everything from that perspective.
Hmm.
So disease awareness, for example, is a huge part of what we do, because you cannot really use the brand names, but you can build category. And
Right.
there are diseases even today, like diabetes. I mean, India is, the prevalence in India for diabetes is really high. Yet, if you actually go down to the details of it, you will see that the awareness levels are not optimum. There is
Hmm.
still scope for people to understand what it means to how they can prevent it. For example, there is a stage called pre-diabetes. If you are able to diagnose that, you can actually prevent the onset of diabetes, or at least delay it. That kind of awareness level, still needs to be built on. So
Right.
coming back to the point that, at the end of the day, there are several disease awareness campaigns that can be run, and that depends on the complexity in the country or the need in the country. So, these are kind of similar aspects that, from a global standpoint to a country standpoint can be run. I think what's the big differentiator is that the kind of regulations in the country. So, for
Hmm.
example, India is largely a self-pay market, right? You have the insurance, but you have and okay, now with Ayushman Bharat, things are changing. You're really looking at the whole public insurance policy schemes, but
Right.
we didn't have that until now. So therefore, the stakeholders you interact with, the kind of information you need to give, the frequency of information that you need to get is all defined in a certain way. If you take that, juxtapose that with a country like, for example, Germany, where
Hmm.
it is universal healthcare, the government takes care of it, so then your conversations are different. Then you're talking to policymakers to be able to help them understand what this means, the impact of this disease, the economic impact of the disease, the social
Right.
impact of the disease. So the kind of communication, gets impacted by the kind of stakeholders that you're also addressing.
Interesting. So, I'm assuming based on what I hear and the role that you are in right now, the kind of stakeholders that you speak to would be more than just media, right? So, how many stakeholders, what kind of stakeholders do you speak to at any given point of time?
I think the opportunity of working, in the corporate communications role is also that kind of expands your stakeholder group.
Right.
You may or may not necessarily be the front end of that stakeholder group,
Hmm.
but the kind of work you do, the kind of strategies you help develop, gets input. That I think that has an impact on the kind of stakeholders. So, for example, even within the company, a large part of it, from a communications person's role, still is about media, still is
Right.
about general population. From an organizational point of view, it's also about internal stakeholders, right? And for all the other, like government affairs or policy or market access, or even commercial, I mean, and even like, the healthcare providers, right? It's a very strict code of conduct, of who interacts with stakeholders. So the medical community internally needs to interact with the healthcare providers, because it cannot be that I can front end that conversation. But at the same time, do we work in those areas? Do we help, develop better communications for all these stakeholders? Most definitely so.
You do on that. So, your role basically encompasses much more than PR, right? In the overall marketing mix in your company as such, what is the value that is placed on PR right now?
Right now, at this moment, thanks to, not thanks
Not
to, but due to the pandemic, it's absolutely critical, because whichever stakeholder you're interacting with, you really need to make sure that the communications is in line with the overall philosophy of the company, with whether it's correct in terms of stakeholder management. So at this point in time, I would say communications is in every discussion, whether it's an internal HR discussion, whether it's a discussion with governments, whether it's a discussion on medical practitioners. I think right now, my teams are like speaking, at every forum. They're part of every discussion. They really, truly, truly have a seat on the table at this point in time. Um, if not for the urgency of the situation right now, I would say that it's also very um, I think it's a very need to know kind of a basis sometimes, because if you're talking to an R&D team, and their whole discussions are about what's coming 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now. And from a communication standpoint, you don't necessarily need to be in those conversations at that point in time. You need to know about it, but you don't really need to know, because I think a large part of what we do is also, pretty much in the immediate future, that kind of a thing. So it depends. I think the degrees of interaction, the degrees of engagement vary. I would say as a thumb rule, maybe in terms of leadership communications, or really driving like the strategic aspects of the business, those are constant. Those you are definitely part of.
So, in the last 2 quarters, I would say, what has been the finest example of healthcare PR or communication that you've witnessed on a global level?
You know, um, we've all been in crisis situations, and it's
Right.
about how you respond, what you say, how nuanced your communication is, right? And whether silence is also a language, right? So you realize this. I think the importance of this most importantly during a crisis situation. And when you think of it from a complete like worldview sort of a thing, you realize how governments have responded, how
Right.
governments have communicated what they're doing. I
Right.
don't need to talk, I don't need to really give you a lot of examples or deliberate about this. If you think about a White House briefing, when questions are asked to Trump, and the way he's responding, whether he has the basis in reality or facts, versus I live in Singapore, and I think that the Singapore government has done a fantastic job in terms of communication, the transparency with communication, the empathy, the passion with which they really want to build this and get out of this situation. There have been like live briefings from the prime minister. There have been an inside view, like a live sessions during the parliament when people are really discussing and deliberating what needs to be done. There is access to information every day. There is, you can subscribe to the SMS service, and every day you get to know how many cases, what's happening, what is, how are we being tracked, how are we tracking against the disease. Government has, really used this as an opportunity to open up communication, allied communication around the disease as well, right? In terms of like, giving information on how you protect yourself, what is the guidance on social distancing, all that. So I think I am seeing a great example here where communication has been really leveraged. It's
Right.
the fact that it is transparent, the fact that it's real, the fact that it's timely, and the fact that there is this intent to, get out of this, make you feel much farmer, and you feel like you're part of this process, versus a White House briefing, or versus even like in our country, in India, where there was a time where there were regular briefings, and then suddenly it stopped. The prime minister didn't communicate actively for a long time. But in the state of Kerala, for example, the CM organized every day at 6 p.m. he had a briefing. Every day at 6 p.m. he took questions, and that
Right.
level of interaction and transparency really built the community stronger. So I think that if I mean, there are several examples, but this is one that really shines through in terms of how governments have reacted. Everybody knows that we didn't have all the answers, but it was
Right.
fine to let people know that, and the fact that you had the courage to say it made a big difference.
Amazing. This situation has also given leeway to a lot of the PR community and communication community, I would say, in experimenting with new formats, in experimenting with new ways of communicating. Any particular one that caught your eye?
I think it's you cannot ignore this one. It's this whole impact of digitization. McKinsey calls it the quickening. It says that what we had planned to do in 10 years, we've had to do in 2 months, in 60 days, right? And I think even from a healthcare perspective, there are several countries that believe in the power of personal touch and were hesitant to really go digital. While there were like plans and apps and like the whole technology behind it, there was still this resistance to do this. COVID really pushed
Right.
pushed the boundaries. You really had no choice. We are looking at a situation where even in the next 6 months, we don't know what kind of impact we will really be able to do, right? Whether we are able to fly to other countries to be able to meet those people, those governments. I mean, we really it's not a situation right now. So everything, I mean, what we are doing today is also, I mean, who would have imagined this, like, let's say, I don't know, 5 years ago, or even like a year ago, maybe, this kind of medium, exploitation of this medium for the better, and to be able to reach audiences. This is amazing. So, for example, every year in Chicago, there is a Congress for Cancer. It's like
Right.
the biggest congress, and you really, you had people who working in the industry, working, on the medical side, being present there, and it happens over the weekend, and it's an excellent opportunity to network, to really talk, to really learn about what's happening, what's coming up, what do we expect in the future in terms of therapies, and all that. This year, it was entirely virtual, right? Because there was no way that anybody could travel. If, let's say, the attendance participation was 10,000, this time it was
Right.
like 4 times that, because it was digital. It means it opened up avenues for people to be a part of those discussions, to be really in those rooms where healthcare experts are talking about what are the kind of plans and what are the therapy areas that we need to prepare for the future. So the
Right.
possibilities of what this whole digital explosion has done is amazing. Even in our company, and we were launching a drug for a very rare form of cancer. Typically, you would get into a room with the healthcare professionals to be able to understand their needs, to be able to articulate what this drug really can do, really like have that one-on-one discussion. But this time we had to do it all virtual. Nobody ever imagined this would happen. All the doctor interactions, there's patient tracking, there's whole aspect of e-health, where, for example, if there are medications like, let's say, in growth hormones, where the injection needs to be taken every day, and then there needs to be a monitoring done to be able to evaluate your future doses. This whole e-health aspect, where there is an app that can track what time you've taken the medication, the doctor sees real-time data, is able to counsel the patient on a weekly basis. Imagine the possibility of that not happening without digital. Life
Correct.
was as normal because of all of these, because of these apps and technologies that were employed, and maybe scaled up exponentially during this time.
Completely agree. I think even in PR and communication, as such, it has accelerated the process. I believe we've been talking about digital PR and getting digital more involved in PR, I think, for the last 10 years now. But the kind of progress that we made in the last 6 months has been amazing.
Yeah.
You know, we have an interesting question from one of our viewers. Can you share your most successful or memorable healthcare PR case study from India till date?
There are a few. We did a whole campaign around, it was called Break the Silence. It was around fertility issues in India, of how, the stigma attached to fertility issues, especially how it lands on the woman, because at the end of the day, we had data, so I'm not speaking off my hat here, but, men wouldn't get tested. There was reluctance to even get tested. So sometimes, very often the problem was not even with the woman, but um, the stigma was attached to her, right? And the onus of not having a child or not being able to bear a child was solely on her. And I mean, this is the cultural aspect of it. This is how traditionally things have moved, and we really wanted to address that aspect of it. And this whole campaign was called Break the Silence. Um, Encouraging people to have those conversations, encouraging, you know, a living room conversation with your extended family on how this impacts you and how you can look for solutions. The fact that you can have a conversation around it can lead to opportunities to solve the potential problem. So for example, if the husband refuses to talk about it, there's no way that you can drag him to a clinic to get tested, right? So it was around that. It was a very very emotional, very heartfelt kind of a campaign, because we based it on real stories. um, and it gained like a lot of traction online as well. This is many years ago, but it still is quite close to my heart, because at the end of the day, it was, let's say, one video on YouTube, which then got like shared, and people really started using that as the conversation starter, to be able to use that video to say, okay, maybe we should also start talking about this. And it was a great case study from India. It got replicated across the region, and we had a chance to also present it at a global level. So there were two instances which really like brought that back home for me. One of our colleagues who was in Germany saw the campaign and was like, was just crying, because she really felt that that was her story, and she had not had the chance to talk about it. And when we were developing the campaign, we were looking at it from a very Indian context, to say that
Right.
stigma attached to it is in that sense inherently ours. But for me, that was such a moment, because it told me that at the end of the day, this is not about like cultural boundaries or geographical boundaries, or the kind of upbringing you've had. This is such a universal kind of a feeling, and the fact that this little tool can help someone maybe look for a solution in their lives. This was one. And the very initially in my career, I was working on a project with Novartis on this drug called Glivec. Sorry.
That was a very heartfelt one. I got goosebumps.
Yes, I am still. When I think about it, I have that visual like in front of my eyes, and I feel very emotional about it myself. And
You
that
know,
whole process of developing it, like really making sure that we are not exploiting the sentiments, wrongly in that sense. To be really looking at it from a very neutral perspective, to see how is this really going to help, and the fact that it really crossed boundaries, cultural, geographical. This is just purely about human emotion in that sense.
brilliant. And you were mentioning the second one.
Yes. So, like I said, early on in my career, I was working on a project with Novartis. It was about this drug called Glivec, which I mean, was in the news for a very long time. We were trying to build advocacy around it, because the company wanted patent protection, to be able to justify how we bring that to market. But at the same time, the company knew that this was out of reach for a lot of a lot of the patients who really need this drug, and it was like one of those that you really needed to have it timely to be able to survive. So
Right.
there was it was a patient assistance program, which essentially meant that the company would also fund, for needy patients, the company would fund the entire treatment, which was like very expensive. And there was this strong commitment from the company to do that. And because of that patient assistance program, there are many patients who really survived. So
Because
if the company would have said, no, we will only look at from a sale perspective and not do this, a lot of lives were at stake. So this I was part of that, like I said, many years ago. And last month, I got introduced to someone through a friend who just moved in from India. And, I was just trying to be a good host in the country and also trying to support in terms of, what you can do and things like that. And she opened up to me and told me about how she was part of this patient assistance program. She was someone who had, who got detected like when she was 25 years old, just when she was like raring to go, and she thought her life was over, and there was no financial means to be able to, look at that treatment option. But because of this assistance program, like she's thriving, she's back on her feet, she's raring to go, she has a new lease on life. And like for me, seeing that person in front of me, talking about this, I mean, it just
very
sort of
fast.
came, full circle. And then I said, okay, this is why I do what I do. This is why I get up in the morning and I have the energy to do what I do. So it's like really amazing. I'm just emotional.
That must have been so rewarding. I think in a lot of ways, people say that PR is pretty much a thankless job. But
It is to a large extent.
I think now it's become more rewarding as such. I think when it's a time of crisis, that's when you really get to know the worth of who you are and what you bring to the table. But I think in your case, such instances must be so rewarding.
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely. I mean, you can really look back, and at the end of the day, these emotional connects. This is really, this is when you look back, this is what shines bright at you, and gives you like the energy to sort of move forward.
So, your most difficult campaign, I mean, these were the ones that you really loved, but was there a campaign that you did that, you were not really sure of or you considered very difficult?
I think, for us, this is such a people's business, right? I mean, we draw our energy from the people we interact with, the quality of interactions that we have. And while I just had the opportunity to tell you like the real emotional side and the exhilarating side of it, there are business decisions which are, imperative and need to be done, and it must be a tough decision. So in one of our markets, we had to close down a business, and I was working very closely with that country, and I knew most of the people. When we had to close down the business, we outsourced it to another company, but not all our people could move, right? Which essentially meant that we had to let go of a large part of our workforce, with benefits and all of that, but it essentially meant separation. Um,
Hmm.
and because of being involved in the project, I mean, I knew of it like, let's say, 6-8 months before the actual implementation. So to be able to work behind the scenes with the management team to be able to understand, from a legal aspect, what is important, how do we make sure that communications can lead into that, making
Right.
sure we have the Q&As, the holding statements, all that. But at the same time, being on a day-to-day basis, kind of interacting with those people, knowing that somehow this decision is going to impact them. This, I think, was one of, and this was like last year, so it was also kind of recent. This was tough. This was tough to be able to put that business hat on, to say, this is what needs to be done. When you write in the holding statement that, it's a bunch of words you say, which is neutral, you're supposed to say that. But if you
Right.
separate yourself for one tiny second and you think of the human aspect of that I think was really, really difficult.
I'm sure, I mean, it must have been so painful to do that. Yeah. Okay. So what are your expectations from a PR agency right now?
Okay. It's to be present, to be aware, to really think. So I think of the PR agency as my extension, as my extended arm, which means that it has to be part of me. You know what I mean? Like it cannot work in isolation. So every effort must be made to be able to integrate, to be able to understand, to have that in-depth knowledge and insight to what, to your client's perspective. Um, and I'm really like, I feel that the best thing the agency can do can also be your fact checker, your someone who shows you the mirror from the outside. Because again, from a company perspective, you are drawn into what is important, or from a strategy level, or you're really looking inward. But I think the an agency who can show you the mirror to say that this may or not be the right thing from an overall perspective, um, is something that I think the biggest contribution an agency can do. But that won't happen if you don't do the work to be able to understand both, from an external trends, situational analysis point of view, but also from the in-depth core expertise of what what industry, or the client's perspective in that sense. So um, I think that real, like how you have as friends, there are some friends who stay with you for life and don't hesitate to tell you when you go wrong, or hold you back from falling into a pothole. I think that's the kind of friendship, the client and the agency needs to have, to be able to trust. And the trust is built on experience, in passion, on really wanting the same thing, for your stakeholders.
Interesting. I mean, that would be a dream agency for most clients out there, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, but it's not often like restricted to being a dream. There are partnerships, and you will
Yeah.
see winning partnerships are really built on that trust foundation.
Completely agree. I think the best partnerships are those when they work together as a team rather than as an agency or a client, and are not scared to voice their opinion. I think very often a lot of from the agency aspect of it, at some point they stop voicing their opinion at with the basically because of being fearful of losing the client. They'd rather retain it and do a mistake rather than voice their opinion out there and let them know and show them the mirror.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, I mean, mature relationships are built like that. So it really, you really have to choose which side you want to be on.
Correct. And I think a lot of responsibility or the onus also lies on the client side as well. The brands also need to create an environment where the agency feels safe enough to voice their opinions out there.
I think that onus is on the client side. You know, you cannot put that on the agency side. It really has to begin from the client side, and to be able to create an environment where where we are trying to do things together to be able to grow. that
Right.
that foundation has to be built from the client side. It can obviously be enhanced on both sides, but I think that the fundamental responsibility is on the client side.
Mm. I mean, I can count, I've been lucky and I can count some very good clients who've helped me change my perspective on a client agency relationship. And that's what I choose to imbibe with all future relationships as such. So, your advice for the graduating class of 2020?
Who are serious about PR, or still wondering, what they need to do. I think either way, I mean, it's such a glorious time in your life. You're young, you're ready to take risks, you're ready to experiment. I think it's one of the golden moments in someone's life, when you've done the training and you're really ready to walk into the real world. So
Right.
I mean, at the risk of sounding, like someone who's giving advice, but I would just say that, keep an open mind. You really don't know, how things shape up. Believe in your training, trust your training. but also believe your instincts to say that if this is something that doesn't agree with you, make those decisions early on, but be willing to experiment, And lastly, I mean, there is really no substitute for hard work. So be ready, be willing to put in those hours, to be able to understand, to be able to be wrong, to be able to be rejected, be willing to put in those hours. And honestly, I mean, things will work from there.
Brilliant. I think there is no other substitute for hard work, and that was very well put, Rimi. We are running out of time. Last question of the day. Let's end it on a fun note. If you were not in communications, what would you be doing right now?
Hmm. If not for COVID, I think I would like I often describe myself as a suitcase heart. Um, I feel like I can just pack up whatever essential and travel the world. I think it's a beautiful place and it has a lot to offer. On a serious note, if you ask me what I would do as my career, I honestly don't know because, like I said, this story of mine, as cliche as it may sound, I feel is something that happened. It is a question of destiny. So I do have a host of hobbies to choose from, a host of things that I'm good at, and maybe I would have I don't know, started baking or doing some art, or started pursuing opportunities with vocal, with singing, etc., and all of that. But at the end of the day, if you really think, if I really think where I would dedicate my skills, my training to what I'm doing. I think I don't have an answer to alternate to communications.
So you're living the dream, and that's how it should be.
I hope it continues to be a dream and doesn't turn into a nightmare at some stage.
I mean, I'm sure we all have our nightmare situations, but it's always lovely to talk to a person who loves what they're doing, because I believe when you love what you do, you prosper in it any which ways. Yeah.
Yes. And I do honestly think that, yes, I did the hard work, but I was also fortunate to be in places where I was, to be able to have those opportunities. There
Right.
are always times you might have the opportunities, but it's also about how you capitalize on them and to be able to really look at it. I think it happened organically in my case, so I'm very thankful to that. And yes, in some way, I mean, when you first said it, perhaps it was difficult for me to accept it, but a minute later, I do think, Tarun, that maybe I am living my dream. This is the best of where I could bring in from my aptitude and my skill, and what I really love in terms of doing. Um, and at the end of the day, knowing that every single thing that I do, I need to be responsible because it at the end of that value chain, it impacts someone's life. To be able to do that with every single thing that you do, I think that's tremendous. And that gives me, it's really my fuel to keep going. That's the reason I get up in the morning every day.
Awesome. It's so lovely to hear that. So, on that note, we will end today's session with Rimi. Thank you so much for taking out the time to speak to us today, Rimi. We really appreciate all the insights you shared, and you literally bared your heart. You showed us the moon side of PR and the real impacts that it can have. And I sincerely hope that everybody who gets into healthcare PR, or in this profession, has more of these rewarding moments, right? And I'm sure the PR community will greatly benefit from all of it.
Thank you, Tarun, for this opportunity. I mean, I wasn't sure if I was in a position to add value, but like you said, this is really like my life story. And at the end of the day, this is really what I can share. And if it helps even one person who's listening, I think it's really worth it. So thank you for giving me this platform. I wouldn't have voluntarily come onto it if you didn't push me to it. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So that was Rimmi Harindran speaking to us about healthcare PR. I hope this session will help you understand more about the sector and add these learnings to your PR campaigns. Thank you so much for joining us today. And of course, a big shout out to our media partners at Gully for supporting us. So that's all from us today at PRPOI. See you next Saturday.